The cold wind pressed against my face as I walked slowly down the cobblestone street, clutching the basket I had prepared with trembling hands. Christmas lights twinkled above the narrow lane, strung between houses that seemed to glow with warmth and life. Behind every window there was laughter, shadows moving, silhouettes gathering around dinner tables where families reunited. And then there was me, an old woman walking alone, heart pounding with equal parts hope and fear. I had told myself all morning that this would be the year things would be different, that Daniel, my only son, my pride, my life's work, would open the door with a smile, invite me in, and say, "Mom, I've missed you. Come inside." I rehearsed it in my mind while baking the cookies, while tying the ribbon around the toy train I had bought for little Oliver, my grandson. I even whispered it to myself as I put on my worn coat, the one that had seen too many winters. The basket was heavy, but not because of what was inside. No, its true weight came from the memories stitched into every single item. The gingerbread cookies were baked from the recipe I had once used when Daniel was small. I remembered him sneaking into the kitchen, his little fingers stealing a piece of dough while I pretended not to notice. I remembered his laughter, sticky with sugar, as he begged for just one more. And the toy train. Oh, the toy train. I could still see Daniel's face the Christmas morning I gave him his first one. We had no money for fancy gifts, but I had saved all year, taking extra shifts at the bakery, just so he could have that one toy. His eyes had lit up brighter than the Christmas star on top of our tree. That moment alone had made every sacrifice worth it. Now, decades later, I hoped history could repeat itself, that my grandson would feel the same joy. Maybe, just maybe, Oliver would look at me and see not just an old woman, but a grandmother who loved him endlessly. Maybe he would run into my arms, and Daniel's heart would soften, even for a second. As I approached the familiar house, my son's house, I slowed down. My breath turned to fog in the cold December air. The snow crunched beneath my shoes, each step echoing louder in my ears than the church bells that chimed in the distance. The house was alive. I could hear music, the faint sound of carols and laughter spilling from inside. Through the frosted window, I caught a glimpse of the Christmas tree, tall and beautifully decorated, surrounded by wrapped gifts that gleamed under the soft glow of lights. My chest tightened. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more longing, a painful reminder of how far away I had drifted from the family I once belonged to. I stood at the foot of the steps for a long moment, clutching the basket so tightly my knuckles turned. Why should I really knock? What if he didn't want me here? What if he turned me away in front of everyone? The shame of that thought burned in my stomach. But then I whispered to myself, "It's Christmas. He can't turn me away at Christmas." Gathering my courage, I climbed the steps and knocked gently on the door. My heart raced. My breath caught in my throat. Inside, the laughter paused. Footsteps approached. My chest lifted with fragile hope. The door creaked open, and there he was. My son. Daniel stood before me, taller and broader than the boy I once cradled, but with the same sharp jawline and deep-set eyes that reminded me so much of his father. His hair was neater now, streaks of silver, catching the light. He wore a warm sweater, and behind him I could see movement. His wife, Emma, setting dishes on the table, and Oliver running excitedly in circles near the Christmas tree. For a fleeting moment, my heart leaped. He had opened the door. He had seen me. Surely this was the start of reconciliation. "Daniel," I whispered, my lips trembling into a hopeful smile. "Merry Christmas, darling. I brought something for Oliver." I lifted the basket slightly, my hands shaking, but his expression didn't soften. His face was stiff, unreadable, as though he had been expecting this moment and dreading it. "Mom," he said, his voice flat, not warm, not cold, just flat. My throat tightened. I thought I could stop by just for a little while. "I miss you all so much." He shifted, glancing over his shoulder quickly before lowering his voice. "Why are you here?" The words cut sharper than the icy air. "It's Christmas," I stammered, my eyes watering. "I wanted to see you and Oliver." "Please, Daniel." Just before I could finish, he leaned closer, his eyes hard. "You're not wanted here anymore." And just like that, the door shut. The sound was final, like a judge's gavel. I stood frozen, staring at the painted wood as the echo of his words rang in my ears. My basket slipped slightly in my hands, and I struggled to keep my grip. From inside, laughter resumed, muffled now, as though I had never even existed. The cold seeped through my coat, into my bones. But the chill in my heart was worse. I took a step back, my legs unsteady, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall. My son had shut me out not just of his home, but of his life. I turned slowly, my shoes crunching on the snow once more, and began the long walk back into the night. Behind me, the house glowed brighter than ever, a beacon of family joy that excluded me completely. Ahead of me stretched the empty street, silent and endless, and in that moment, with the toy train heavy in my basket and the sound of my son's words replaying in my head, I knew this Christmas would change me forever. The night swallowed me as soon as I stepped away from Daniel's door. The warmth that spilled from his house, glowing with family and festivity, was behind me now, like a lighthouse I wasn't welcome in. The contrast cut deep, his laughter still echoing faintly from inside, while my breath fogged in the bitter air, the snow crunching underfoot in a rhythm that seemed to mark the loneliness of my steps. The street was beautifully decorated, each house shimmering with garlands, wreaths, and twinkling lights, but for me, the lights felt cruel. They illuminated a world I no longer belonged to. Children's laughter burst from one doorway, a father carrying a box of presents into another. Couples walked past me, arms linked, carrying bags of food and bottles of wine for their gatherings. I must have looked like a ghost drifting among them, an old woman with tired eyes, holding a basket too heavy for her frail hands. No one noticed me, or maybe they pretended not to. The toy train dug into my heart with every step. I imagined Oliver's little face if I had managed to place it into his hands. Would he have squealed with joy the way Daniel once did? Would he have hugged me tightly, unknowing of the walls his father had built between us? Or would Daniel have snatched it away, telling him that Grandma's gifts were not welcome either? The thought made me stop walking. My knees buckled slightly as the snow gathered on my boots. I clutched the basket close, as if holding on to a memory I refused to let slip. The cold was merciless, biting at my cheeks, seeping into my bones. I turned the collar of my coat upward, wishing for the scarf I had forgotten in my rush to leave the house earlier. I had been so consumed by hope, so certain this Christmas might be different, that I hadn't even thought about protecting myself from the winter chill. As I continued down the narrow street, my mind drifted back to other Christmases, ones long past. I remembered Daniel's first Christmas after his father died. He was only 12. I had worked 2 jobs then, barely sleeping, but I still scraped together enough for a small tree and a second-hand bicycle that leaned slightly to the left. Daniel had pretended not to notice its flaw, riding it with unshakable joy until his cheeks turned red from the cold. That night, he had hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You're the best, Mom," he had whispered. I carried those words with me for years like a medal. How had that boy become the man who looked me in the eye tonight and said, "You're not wanted here anymore"? My steps slowed again as tears filled my eyes. The snow blurred around me, shimmering under the lampposts like broken glass. I wanted to believe there was still some part of that boy inside him, buried under bitterness or anger. But maybe I was lying to myself. Maybe that part of him had been erased completely. As I passed the small church at the corner of the square, its bells rang out softly. The sound echoed through the crisp air, solemn and beautiful. A few people lingered by the steps, chatting, their faces lit with warmth. I longed to go inside, to sit in the wooden pews and let the calm wash over me. But my legs carried me forward, toward the tiny flat I now called home. It wasn't far, just 3 blocks away, but it felt like miles. My thoughts were heavier than my steps, weighing me down with each memory. I remembered Daniel's teenage years, the arguments, the slammed doors, the nights I stayed up waiting for him to come home, praying he was safe. He had always been restless, desperate to escape the small-town life we lived in. When he finally left for university in London, I had stood on the platform waving until the train was nothing but smoke and sound. I had told myself it was good that he was building a life bigger than mine had ever been, but deep down, I knew I was waving goodbye to the closeness we once had. The cold wind pulled me back to the present. My cheeks were numb, and my fingers, gripping the handle of the basket, felt stiff and swollen. I glanced down at it once more, the ribbon on the toy train peeking out. A sudden wave of humiliation hit me. What was I doing, bringing this here, like some unwanted guest begging for scraps of love? I quickened my pace, wanting to reach the safety of my small flat before the tears finally broke free. The streets grew quieter as I turned onto narrower roads, where the lights were dimmer and fewer people walked. A single car passed, its headlights sweeping across me before disappearing into the night. And then I heard it. Children's laughter, again, not Oliver's, different voices, distant but clear. They were playing in the snow in the courtyard of an apartment block. Their joy stung me. I should have been inside Daniel's house, sitting by the fire, watching Oliver open his gifts, listening to his laughter. Instead, I was here, outside, unwanted, a stranger to my own blood. I slowed, the sound echoing in my chest until it became unbearable. My vision blurred again, and I realized I had stopped walking altogether. My knees trembled. For a moment, I thought I might collapse into the snow, but then something unexpected happened. I heard my name, soft, hesitant, a voice from the past. Margaret. I turned sharply, my heart leaping. Across the street, under the faint glow of a lamppost, stood an old man bundled in a thick coat and scarf. His posture was slightly stooped, but his eyes, pale blue and familiar, widened as they met mine. That was Mr. Collins, my late husband's closest friend. I hadn't seen him in years. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. Then my lips parted. George. He crossed the street carefully, the snow crunching beneath his boots. When he reached me, his face softened, though sadness clouded his features as he took in my appearance, the basket, the tears, the way I stood trembling in the cold. Margaret, he said gently, his voice carrying the kind of concern that felt foreign after so many years without it. What are you doing out here, in this weather, on Christmas night? I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. My voice finally broke, low and cracked. He shut the door on me. George, my own son, he told me I'm not wanted anymore. The weight of the admission nearly brought me to my knees. George reached out quickly, steadying me with his gloved hand. His jaw tightened, and for a moment his kind eyes turned stormy. That boy, he muttered under his breath. I shook my head, clutching the basket tightly to my chest. Please, don't be angry with him. Maybe he's right. Maybe I've made too many mistakes. George looked at me, his eyes steady. Or maybe he's forgotten where he came from. Forgotten who gave him everything he has today. I couldn't answer. My throat ached with unshed tears. Come, George said finally, his voice firm but kind. You shouldn't be out here alone. Walk with me a while. I think it's time we talked. The snow seemed quieter once George walked beside me, as if the world itself had softened in his presence. His steps were steady, his cane tapping lightly against the ground in rhythm with mine. For a long while, we said nothing. I was too wrapped in the ache of Daniel's rejection, and George seemed to sense I needed silence before I could speak again. We walked past shuttered shops, their festive window displays glowing faintly even though the doors were locked. My reflection followed me in the glass, a frail old woman clutching a basket, her shoulders hunched, her eyes hollow. I almost didn't recognize myself. George finally broke the silence. I was on my way to midnight mass when I saw you. I wasn't sure at first, but then I thought, it couldn't be anyone else. He paused, his breath clouding the air. Margaret, you shouldn't be wandering these streets alone tonight. You'll make yourself ill. I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Illness might be easier than this emptiness, George. He glanced at me, and I saw the flicker of concern deepen. Don't say that. You're stronger than you think. I've known you too long not to know that. His words tugged at something inside me. A memory surfaced. George at our kitchen table decades ago, laughing with my late husband, Richard. They had been inseparable, the kind of friends who could speak volumes with a single glance. After Richard died, George had come around less often, life carrying us in different directions. Seeing him now felt like stepping back into a life I had buried with Richard. I finally exhaled a shaky breath. Daniel told me I wasn't wanted anymore. He looked right at me and said it. George. Like I was a stranger at his door. George's face hardened. That boy doesn't know the truth, Margaret. I stopped walking. His words caught me off guard. The truth. George turned toward me fully, his eyes holding something I hadn't seen in years, a secret, carefully guarded. Yes, he said slowly, there are things Daniel never knew, things Richard wanted him to know one day, but life had other plans. A chill ran down my spine, sharper than the winter wind. What things? I whispered. George hesitated, his breath fogging between us as though he were weighing whether to speak. His hand gripped his cane tightly. Let's get you inside first. You shouldn't hear this standing in the cold. I followed him without protest. My legs ached, my body exhausted, but my mind was suddenly alight with questions. What could Richard have possibly wanted Daniel to know? And why now, on this night of all nights, was George hinting at truths long buried? We reached my flat, a small, dimly lit space above a bakery that closed early on Christmas Eve. George helped me up the narrow stairs, his hand steady at my elbow. Inside, the air was cold but less biting than the streets. I set the basket down on the table, the toy train's ribbon catching the faint light. George lowered himself into a chair, leaning his cane against the wall. He looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face deeper, but his eyes still carried that unwavering steadiness I had always admired. I sat opposite him, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Please, George, don't keep me in suspense. What truth are you talking about? He rubbed his chin, his gaze fixed on the floor before meeting mine again. Margaret, you've carried the weight of raising Daniel on your own for so long. You worked yourself to the bone after Richard passed. But Daniel never really understood how much his father loved him, or how much he sacrificed. I felt my chest tighten. I told him, George, I told Daniel's stories, shared memories. I tried to keep Richard alive in his heart. George shook his head slowly. No, there's more. Something Richard entrusted to me before he died. Something I was supposed to give Daniel when the time was right. But that time never seemed to come. And then, well, life pulled us apart. My breath caught. What is it? George reached into the inner pocket of his coat, his movements deliberate, almost hesitant. For a moment, I thought my heart might burst through my chest. When his hand emerged, he was holding a small, weathered envelope. The edges were yellowed, the paper slightly creased. My eyes widened as I saw Richard's handwriting scrawled across the front, Daniel's name. I pressed a hand to my mouth, a sob escaping before I could stop it. My husband's handwriting after all these years. George set the envelope gently on the table between us. Richard wrote this for Daniel. He gave it to me the night before he passed. He said Daniel was too young then, but that, one day, he'd need to read it. He asked me to keep it safe. Tears blurred my vision. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed over the familiar script. All this time, I whispered. George's voice softened. I'm sorry, Margaret. I should have brought it to you sooner. But I thought, maybe it wasn't my place. Maybe you and Daniel were managing fine. And then, when I saw you tonight, he trailed off, shaking his head. I knew I couldn't keep it any longer. The room seemed to shrink around us. The faint ticking of the clock on the wall echoed louder in my ears. My husband's words were inside that envelope, sealed away for decades. Words Daniel had never read. Words that might explain why my son's heart had turned so cold. My fingers tightened on the envelope, but I didn't open it. Not yet. My chest heaved as I looked at George, my voice breaking. Do you think it could change anything? Do you think Daniel would even care? George leaned forward, his eyes steady on mine. I think Richard's voice is the only one that can reach him now. Not yours, not mine, his father's. The envelope trembled in my hands as though it were alive, carrying not just words but the weight of years of love, loss, and unfinished truths. And in that moment, I knew this letter could either heal the fracture between Daniel and me, or confirm that I had truly lost him forever. The envelope lay on the table like a fragile ghost from the past. Its edges were soft with age, the ink slightly faded, but Richard's handwriting was unmistakable. I could trace every curve of the letters in my mind even without looking because, for years, his notes had been my anchor. Grocery lists, love letters slipped under my pillow, reminders taped to the fridge. He had always been a man of words, careful and deliberate, and here he was again, speaking across the chasm of decades. Wanted to open it immediately, to tear through the paper and let his voice rush back into my life. But my hands refused to move. Instead, they clutched the envelope so tightly it wrinkled in my grip. George watched me, his face lined with patience. Margaret, you don't have to read it now. You've carried this long enough. No one would fault you for waiting, but waiting felt unbearable. My throat burned, my eyes stung. What if it doesn't say what I need it to say? I whispered. What if it changes nothing? Daniel won't even look at me. George. He shut me out as if I were a beggar on his doorstep. George leaned forward, his cane resting against the chair. And what if it says exactly what Daniel needs to hear? What if it's the key that unlocks him? His words pressed on me, but so did fear. I thought of Daniel's face that night, the door slamming, his voice hard and cold. You're not wanted anymore. Could a letter from a man he barely remembered shift that kind of bitterness? I closed my eyes, and Richard's voice came back, faint but clear. Maggie, promise me one thing. Don't let Daniel forget how much I love him. The memory cracked me open. My chest ached, my breath shallow. My fingers finally moved, sliding under the flap of the envelope. The paper tore softly, like the sigh of a memory returning. Inside was a folded sheet, yellowed at the edges. My hands shook as I opened it, the familiar slant of Richard's pen pulling me back to another lifetime. I began to read. My dearest Daniel, if you are reading this, it means I wasn't able to stay long enough by your side. That thought alone breaks me, but I want you to know something before anything else. My leaving you was not a choice. It was never a choice. If I could have, I would have stayed until I was old and gray, until you no longer needed me. But life took me too soon. I worry that as you grow, you will think I abandoned you. That is why I write this. I need you to know that I never left because I wanted to. I fought, Daniel. I fought so hard to stay. Your mother Margaret is stronger than anyone I've ever known. She will raise you with everything she has, but it will be hard for her. Please, don't ever blame her for the choices life forced upon her. She will sacrifice more than you'll ever see. Love her, Daniel. Protect her when I can't. There is one more truth I must tell you. You were not only my son, you were my dream come true. The day you were born, I held you in my arms and thought, this is it. This is the best thing I will ever do. And I was right. Daniel, when the world feels cold, remember that you carry my blood, my laughter, and my love in you. Nothing, not time, not death can erase that. Take care of your mother. She is my heart, and she is yours too. With all my love, Dad. By the time I finished, the paper was soaked with my tears. The words blurred, but they were burned into my soul. Richard had written them not for me, but for our son, the boy who now turned his back on me. George's hand rested gently on mine. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it back into the envelope as though sealing Richard's voice inside again. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, trembling. This changes everything, I whispered, though I didn't yet know how. George nodded. Then you must give it to him. I shook my head, fear choking me. He won't take it. He won't even open the door. Then you'll have to find a way, George said firmly. His tone carried the weight of a man who knew secrets, who had watched life turn cruel and still believed in its chances. Richard entrusted that letter to me because he trusted you to do what was right. Don't let fear stop you. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second stretching. Outside, faint bells from the midnight mass drifted through the night. The world was celebrating, but inside me there was only war between fear and hope, between despair and love. At last, I tucked the letter into my coat pocket. It felt heavy there, heavier than paper should be. A burden, yes, but also a chance. Maybe my last chance. I rose slowly, my knees stiff. I'll go tomorrow, I whispered. Christmas morning. Maybe that will mean something. George stood too, his cane tapping as he steadied himself. It will mean everything, Margaret. Trust me. We didn't speak further. He saw me to my bed, made sure the heater clicked on, then quietly left. But I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my fingers brushing the envelope in my pocket again and again. Tomorrow I would face my son. And tomorrow, Richard's voice, long buried, might finally be heard. The world outside my window was blanketed in white, the kind of snowfall that turned every roof and tree into something out of a postcard. Yet, despite the beauty, I woke with a hollow ache in my chest. My first thought was the letter. My second was Daniel. I hadn't slept a minute, but exhaustion didn't matter. Today was Christmas morning, and with it came the weight of a promise I could no longer push aside. Richard's words had settled into me like fire, burning away excuses. Take care of your mother. She is my heart, and she is yours too. If Daniel ever read those words, maybe the walls he'd built around his heart would crack. I dressed slowly, my fingers clumsy, as I buttoned my worn cardigan. My coat hung by the door, the envelope already tucked inside its pocket. Each time I brushed against it, I felt Richard's presence urging me forward. When I stepped outside, the air bit at my cheeks. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked toward Daniel's street. The village was quiet, most families still gathered around trees, laughter and warmth spilling from their houses. I imagined mothers being kissed on the cheek, children tearing through wrapping paper, fathers lighting fires in hearths. A picture-perfect holiday, but not mine. Mine had been stolen the night Daniel slammed that door in my face. My legs felt heavier with each step, but I pressed on, passing familiar landmarks. The bakery where Daniel once begged for sugared croissants. The park bench where Richard had kissed me under a blanket of falling leaves. Every place held a memory, and each one whispered, "Don't give up now." By the time I reached Daniel Street, my breath came in sharp clouds. His house stood at the end, festive lights twinkling in the windows. Through the curtains, I glimpsed movement shadows of my son's family around the Christmas tree. I stopped dead in my tracks. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body screamed to turn around, to walk back to George's warm little house, to spare myself the humiliation of another slammed door. But then I remembered Richard's words again, and I whispered them to myself. Love her, Daniel. Protect her when I can't. I tightened my grip on the letter. Step by step, I climbed the path to his door. My boots left a trail of wet prints behind me. Each one felt like a marker of courage I might not have tomorrow. When I reached the door, I hesitated, staring at the wreath hung neatly in the center. Red berries, pine cones, a ribbon. I thought of how Daniel and I used to make wreaths together when he was small. His tiny fingers had clumsily tied bows while Richard laughed at our crooked creations. My heart ached with the memory. I raised my hand to knock but froze when I heard laughter inside. A child's laughter, light, bubbling, pure. My granddaughter, a sound I hadn't been allowed to share. I swallowed the lump in my throat and knocked softly. The laughter dimmed. Voices murmured. Footsteps approached. The door swung open, and there stood Daniel. His expression shifted the moment he saw me, from surprise to irritation, then to something colder. Mother, he said flatly. I forced a smile, though my lips trembled. Merry Christmas, Daniel. He didn't move to invite me in. Behind him, I saw the glow of the tree, presents piled high, his wife arranging plates on the table. A scene so warm it hurt to look at. What are you doing here? His voice was firm, a barricade. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket, fingers brushing the envelope. I have something for you. My voice cracked, but I steadied it. From your father. For the first time, his eyes flickered. A shadow of something, doubt, maybe, or curiosity passed over his face. But just as quickly, he shut it down. Mother, not today, he said sharply. This is our Christmas. You can't keep showing up like this. I felt my knees weaken. Please, Daniel, just read this. It's from him, from Richard. His jaw tightened, and his voice rose. Enough. Don't drag Dad into this. He's gone, and nothing will change that. The words cut like knives. Behind him, his wife appeared, her eyes narrowing at me. Daniel, close the door, she said quietly but firmly, as if I were a stray animal begging at their step. Daniel hesitated. His hand gripped the door, ready to push it shut again. The memory of that sound, the slam echoing in my chest, flashed back so vividly I flinched. I pulled the envelope out, thrusting it forward with trembling hands. Don't shut me out without this. Just read it once. If it means nothing, I'll never come back. But if it means something, my voice broke, then you'll understand. For a long moment, he stared at the envelope, his eyes locked on the handwriting he hadn't seen since he was a child. His lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. His children's laughter drifted again from the living room, breaking the stillness. Finally, Daniel exhaled sharply. Leave it, he muttered, his voice almost reluctant. I'll look at it later. He didn't take it. He simply gestured to the doorstep. My heart sank, but I bent, carefully placing the envelope on the doormat, as though laying down my last piece of hope. Daniel's eyes softened for just a second, but then his expression hardened again. Goodbye, Mother, he said, and before I could answer, the door closed, not slammed, just closed. I stood there in the cold, staring at the wreath, at the little strip of envelope still visible under the doorframe. Snowflakes melted on my cheeks, or maybe they were tears, I couldn't tell. Then I turned and walked back down the path, my footsteps heavy. Behind me, Christmas carried on without me. But somewhere inside that house, on that doorstep, a letter waited. And with it, a chance. Daniel hadn't touched the envelope all morning, at least, not when anyone could see. After he'd closed the door on me, his wife, Claire, shot him a pointed look. "Why do you let her do this to you every year?" she muttered under her breath. Daniel had shrugged, pretending to be unfazed, but his hand had twitched when he heard the faint sound of my boots retreating. That sound had stayed with him even as his children ripped open their gifts, and laughter filled the living room. Now, hours later, when the children were napping and Claire was tidying the kitchen, Daniel found himself alone by the doorway. His eyes drifted down to the small white envelope, still resting against the edge of the doormat where I had placed it. Snow had dampened the corner, but the handwriting, his father's familiar, steady script, was unmistakable. His chest tightened. He hadn't seen that handwriting in nearly 20 years. He remembered it on birthday cards, on notes tucked into his school lunchbox, on little reminders left for his mother on the kitchen counter. It was Richard's handwriting, and Richard was gone. Daniel bent down, picked it up, and held it in his hands. His fingers brushed the edges carefully, almost reverently. He shouldn't care. He'd told himself that for years his mother was manipulative, overbearing, always trying to insert herself into his life. At least, that was the story he repeated to himself whenever she appeared. It was easier than facing the gnawing guilt that maybe he had pushed her too far away. But now, staring at the letter, the narrative cracked. His pulse quickened. He slipped it into his jacket pocket before Claire could see. He didn't want to explain, not yet. Not when his own emotions were this raw. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Daniel crept down the stairs. The house was dark, only the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights flickering against the walls. He sat at the dining table, the letter before him, and just stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a shaky breath, he broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, yellowed slightly with age. As he unfolded it, his throat tightened. His father's handwriting filled the page. "Daniel, my son." The words blurred for a moment as his eyes welled. He blinked hard and read on. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to tell you myself. There are things I need you to know, things I never said enough when I was alive. First, love your mother. Protect her when I can't. She gave everything for you, her time, her health, her dreams, without complaint. If she seems overbearing, sometimes, remember, it comes from love, not control. I fear that one day you will misunderstand her heart. Don't shut her out, Daniel. Don't make her carry her burdens alone. She is my heart, and she is yours too. If I could ask only one thing of you after I'm gone, it would be this: do not turn away from her." Daniel's vision blurred again, his father's words hammering through the years of silence he had built. He dropped the letter to the table, and pressed his hands against his face. He thought of me, standing in the cold outside his door. He thought of how my voice had trembled when I said, "Just read this. If it means nothing, I'll never come back." A sob caught in his throat. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the truth pressing against the walls he had so carefully built. His anger hadn't been about me at all. It had been about himself, his guilt for not being the son his father had wanted him to be, for resenting the woman who had carried the weight of their lives after Richard's death. He sat there for hours, the letter clutched in his hands, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. When the house finally stirred at dawn, Daniel tucked the letter into his pocket again, but something inside him had shifted. He knew he couldn't keep pretending. He had to see me. He had to make it right. The first light of morning spilled weakly through the lace curtains of Margaret's tiny flat. The radiators rattled but gave little warmth. She hadn't slept. The letter she had left at Daniel's door weighed heavily in her mind all night. She sat hunched on the sofa, a thin blanket pulled around her shoulders, staring at the faint embers in the fireplace. Her thoughts raced. Did he read it? Or did he throw it away the moment he saw my handwriting? Maybe he laughed. Maybe Claire tore it up. Maybe I've humiliated myself again. The hours crawled by in silence. She had boiled water for tea 3 times, but each time, forgotten to drink it. The porcelain cup sat untouched on the table, the steam long since vanished. She kept glancing toward the window, though she told herself not to. Expectation had been her downfall too many times before. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence. A knock. It wasn't timid. It was firm, deliberate, almost urgent. Margaret froze, her heart stopping mid-beat. No one ever came this early. Her breath caught in her throat as another knock followed, louder. For a moment, she was afraid to hope. Slowly, with trembling hands, she set the blanket aside and shuffled toward the door. Each step seemed to echo through her small flat. She reached for the handle, hesitated, and whispered under her breath, "Don't be foolish, Margaret. It's probably the postman, or Mrs. Renault from downstairs." But when she opened the door, her breath caught. There stood Daniel. His hair was tousled, his coat thrown over his pajamas, and in his hand, crumpled, but held tightly, was the letter. His eyes, red-rimmed from sleeplessness, locked onto hers. For a moment, neither spoke. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. She felt her knees weaken. Daniel broke the silence first. His voice was hoarse. "Why didn't you ever tell me Dad wrote this?" Margaret blinked, tears immediately welling. Because it wasn't about me, Daniel. It was about you. I thought maybe one day you'd be ready." Daniel's jaw clenched as he lifted the paper, his hand shaking. "I read it, ma'am. I read every word. And I hated myself for how I treated you yesterday. For years." Margaret raised a trembling hand to her mouth. She hadn't allowed herself to imagine this moment. He continued, his voice breaking. "I shut the door on you last night. But Dad's words, he begged me not to do exactly that. And I've done it over and over again." Margaret couldn't hold back any more. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "You're here now. That's all that matters." Daniel stepped inside without asking, and for the first time in years, he embraced his mother. His shoulders shook as he pressed his face against hers. Margaret clung to him, her hands trembling, as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. The room was silent except for their uneven breaths. Years of distance dissolved in that embrace. But even in that moment of fragile reconciliation, Margaret felt a shadow pass over her heart. She knew Claire. She knew how strong her dislike was. If Daniel was here, it meant conflict waited for him back at his own home. Margaret whispered cautiously, "Does Claire know where you've gone?" Daniel pulled back slightly, his face clouding. "She knows soon, and she won't like it." A heavy pause filled the space between them. Margaret's chest tightened with dread. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a battle she never wanted her son to fight. When Daniel finally left Margaret's flat that morning, the December air bit sharply at his skin. He walked quickly, the crumpled letter from his late father still clutched in his pocket. His chest was tight, not just from the cold, but from the storm he knew awaited him at home. Margaret had begged him to stay for tea, her voice trembling, her eyes wet with both joy and fear. But Daniel knew he couldn't delay. Claire would already be awake, and she was not a woman who tolerated surprises. The short walk to his house felt like miles. Christmas wreaths hung on neighbors' doors. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the streets, and yet Daniel felt only the weight of conflict pressing down on him. His heart pounded harder with every step. By the time he reached his driveway, he saw her dock. Claire stood by the front door, arms crossed, her robe cinched tightly, her face pale with fury. The moment she spotted him, her eyes narrowed into sharp slits. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the frosty yard. "It's Christmas morning, Daniel, and you sneak out like a thief." Daniel inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He reached the door, but before he could even insert his key, Claire blocked him. Her eyes flickered to his pocket. "You've been to see her, haven't you, your mother?" Daniel's throat tightened. "Yes, I went to see Mum." The air between them crackled like ice ready to shatter. Claire's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Unbelievable. After everything we've said, after everything I've done to protect this family from her guilt-tripping, her manipulations, you go running back to her on Christmas morning." Daniel's voice rose, sharper than he intended. "Protect this family. Claire, she's my mother. She raised me alone when no one else would. She gave up her life for me, and I." His voice broke as he pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolding it with shaking hands. "I've been treating her like she's nothing, like she doesn't exist. Do you know what Dad wrote before he died?" Claire's face tightened, but she didn't answer. Daniel's eyes filled with tears as he read aloud, his voice cracking with every word. "Daniel, promise me, don't shut your mother out. She needs you. One day, you'll need her too. Don't let bitterness steal your love for her." He lowered the letter, his voice trembling. "That's what he wrote. And last night, I slammed the door in her face. On Christmas Eve. The very thing Dad begged me not to do." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. The cold wind whipped Claire's hair across her face, but her expression remained hard. She spoke slowly, each word sharp as glass. "So what now, Daniel? You want her back in your life? You want her sitting at our table, judging me, making me feel like an outsider in my own home?" Daniel's jaw clenched. This isn't about you, Claire. This is about me and my mother. And if you can't accept that, then maybe the problem isn't her. Claire's eyes widened, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. How dare you say that to me? After everything I've given up for this marriage, you're choosing her over me. Daniel's voice steadied, though his heart pounded. No, I'm choosing what's right. I won't abandon her anymore. Not after last night, not after this letter. The silence that followed was colder than the winter air. Claire's hands trembled, whether from anger or fear, Daniel couldn't tell. She stepped aside, letting him through the door, but her voice was a whisper laced with venom. You'll regret this, Daniel. She'll ruin everything. Just wait. Daniel stepped inside, clutching the letter tightly, his pulse hammering in his ears. He didn't know if his marriage could withstand what had just happened. But for the first time in years, he felt certain of one thing. He would no longer betray his mother. Back in her flat, Margaret sat alone, staring at the empty chair across from her. She wanted desperately to believe Daniel's visit had changed something forever, but a deep unease gnawed at her because if Claire had her way, reconciliation would come at a price. Daniel barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw two faces: the hollow sadness in his mother's eyes when he had slammed the door on her Christmas Eve, and the blazing fury in Claire's when he'd come back from Margaret's flat the next morning. The letter from his late father sat on the nightstand. Daniel had read it over and over, as if the ink itself might dissolve and erase the command he had ignored for years. Don't shut your mother out. One day you'll need her too. Beside him, Claire slept restlessly. Or at least, she pretended to. Every time Daniel shifted, her breathing changed slightly quicker, sharper. She wasn't sleeping, she was waiting. Watching. When dawn finally broke, Claire sat up and tied her robe tight. She turned to Daniel with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Coughed it, she asked sweetly. Daniel studied her warily, but nodded. Thanks. Downstairs, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, but the tension was thicker than the steam rising from the cups. Claire set his mug down with a sharp clink, then sat across from him, her eyes fixed on him. So, she began, her tone casual. What's your plan? Daniel looked up from the letter he'd been absent-mindedly folding and unfolding. What do you mean? Claire tilted her head. You've decided she's back in your life. Fine. But how far does this go, Daniel? Weekly visits, dinners, Christmas next year at her flat instead of ours. Her voice hardened. Do you expect me to smile while she judges me, undermines me, makes me feel like an intruder in my own home? Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. Claire, she's not trying to undermine you. She's just lonely. She's my mother. I can't pretend she doesn't exist anymore. Claire leaned forward, her eyes glittering. Lonely. She's manipulative. She knows exactly what she's doing. You think she's helpless, but I see it. Every look, every sigh, every poor me. It's all an act to pull you back in. Daniel's voice rose. That's not true. You weren't there when I left her standing in the cold on Christmas Eve. Do you know what that did to her? Do you know what it did to me? The room fell silent, Daniel's words hanging like frost in the air. Claire blinked, then reached across the table, her tone softening. Daniel, I'm just scared. Scared she'll take you away from me. Scared I'll always come second in your life. Her vulnerability, whether genuine or staged, pierced through Daniel's defenses. He rubbed his temples, torn between guilt and anger. Claire, he said quietly, you'll never come second. But I can't erase her from my life. I won't. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded slowly, but her eyes betrayed the storm beneath. That afternoon, while Daniel buried himself in work emails, Claire quietly dialed her sister. Julia, she's back, Claire whispered, pacing the kitchen. Margaret, he went to see her, and now he's quoting some letter from his father like it's gospel. Julia's voice crackled through the phone. So, what are you going to do? Claire's eyes narrowed as she stared at the framed wedding photo on the wall. Daniel's smile in that picture looked so carefree, so unburdened. I'm not letting her ruin this marriage, Claire hissed. If she thinks she can waltz back into his life and take my place, she's wrong. I'll remind him why he stayed away in the first place. Meanwhile, at her modest flat across town, Margaret sat with the letter spread open on her lap. She traced the lines of her late husband's handwriting, tears blurring the words. For years, she had swallowed her pride, convincing herself Daniel was too busy, too distracted to visit. But now she knew the truth. It wasn't time or distance. It was Claire. The thought cut deep, like a knife twisting slowly. Her son hadn't turned away from her on his own. Someone had guided his hand. Still, she clung to the fragile hope that their Christmas morning meeting had planted a seed. That maybe, just maybe, the letter had broken through the wall between them. But as the days passed, her phone remained silent. No messages, no calls, no invitations. Daniel's silence was deafening. At home, Claire began her subtle work. She never forbade Daniel from seeing Margaret outright. That would have been too obvious, too controlling. Instead, she dropped little comments. She looked frail, didn't she? Don't let her guilt you into thinking you abandoned her. Remember when she refused to help us with the wedding bills? She's always been selfish. Daniel, you've worked so hard to build this home. Don't let anyone drag you backward. Each remark was carefully placed, a small stone added to the wall she was rebuilding between Daniel and Margaret. Daniel resisted at first. He reread his father's words, replayed Margaret's trembling smile when he'd finally stepped inside. Her flat, but doubt has a way of creeping in when whispered day after day. By the end of the week, Daniel still hadn't called his mother, and Margaret sat alone each evening, staring at her silent phone, wondering if hope had betrayed her once again. The first week of January came, gray and wet, the kind of weather that made London feel smaller, heavier. Rain streaked the windows, and Daniel sat at his desk in the home office, staring at his inbox, but seeing nothing. The unopened letter lay beside him. His father's handwriting stared back, a constant reminder. He couldn't focus. Every email he read blurred into the same sentence, over and over. Don't shut your mother out. One day you'll need her too. Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. He felt trapped between loyalty to his wife and duty to his mother, between the life he had built and the past he had buried. The sound of the front door slamming pulled him out of his thoughts. Claire had returned from shopping. He heard the rustle of bags, the clink of bottles, her voice calling out lightly, "Dinner's in an hour, darling." He tried to answer, but his throat was tight. He opened the drawer, pulled out his car keys, and slipped the letter into his coat pocket. Margaret was knitting when the knock came at her flat door. The needles froze in her hands. For weeks, she had told herself not to hope. Each day, she reminded herself, he won't come. Don't wait by the door. Don't stare at the phone. And yet, her heart still leaped at the sound of knuckles against wood. She opened the door slowly, half expecting disappointment. But there he was, Daniel. He looked exhausted, pale, rain dripping from his hair. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel simply whispered, his voice cracking, "Mom." Margaret's lips trembled. She stepped aside without a word, and Daniel entered. They sat in silence on the worn sofa, the small lamp casting a golden glow. Daniel pulled the letter from his coat and placed it on the table between them. "I've read this 100 times, he said hoarsely, "and every time I do, I feel ashamed." Margaret touched the letter, her fingers brushing his. "Your father. He always believed in the bond between us. Even when you stopped coming, he told me not to give up, that one day you'd find your way back." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I let him down. I let you down. Christmas Eve, slamming that door. I don't know how to ask for forgiveness." Margaret leaned forward, placing her trembling hands on his. "Daniel, you're here. That's enough." For the first time in years, Daniel wept openly in front of his mother. Hours passed as they talked about his childhood, about her loneliness, about his marriage. Daniel confessed the pressure Claire had put on him, how her words had slowly turned into walls between them. Margaret listened, but she did not curse Claire. She only said, "You chose her, and I respected that. But love shouldn't ask you to destroy another love. A wife, a mother, there is space for both." Daniel nodded, knowing she was right. Back at his house, Claire paced the kitchen. The roast sat untouched on the counter, the wine unopened. She checked the clock again, 9:15 p.m., when Daniel finally walked in at 10:30, dripping from the rain, but with a strange calmness in his eyes. Claire's anger flared. "Where have you been?" she demanded. Daniel hung up his coat slowly. "At my mother's." Claire's face darkened. "Daniel, we talked about this." "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice firm, stronger than it had been in years. "You talked, I listened. Too much, for too long, and I shut her out because of it." Claire's mouth opened, but no words came. Daniel continued, "Claire, I love you. but I will not live in a house where I have to choose between my wife and my mother. If you can't accept that she's part of my life, then maybe we need to ask ourselves what this marriage is built on." The silence that followed was colder than the rain outside. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Claire resisted, argued, tried to guilt him back into silence, but Daniel stood his ground. He began visiting Margaret every Sunday, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting with her in quiet companionship. Little by little, his home and his heart began to heal. One spring afternoon, Margaret and Daniel visited the cemetery together. They stood before the grave of her late husband, the man who had penned the letter that changed everything. Daniel placed fresh flowers on the grave. His voice broke as he whispered, "Dad, I finally listened. I'm sorry it took so long." Margaret took his hand. He'd be proud, so proud. They stood together, mother and son, no longer separated by silence, by manipulation, or by closed doors. That Christmas door slam became the moment that defined everything, but not in the way Margaret feared. Sometimes families fracture not because love disappears, but because pride, fear, or outside voices drown it out. But love, when given a second chance, can be rebuilt brick by brick, tear by tear. Daniel learned that forgiveness is not about erasing the past, but choosing to write the future differently. And Margaret learned that hope, though painful, can carry you through the darkest winters. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart. And with that, the story of a mother left in the cold became one of warmth, hard won, but unbreakable.